I don't have that much time, so we are just gonna explain this quickly. This is 16 blocks of iron, and I'm gonna make hoppers out of this, and bam, yay. Everything's done except this. My inventory is full, and I don't know what to do. And yes, I have this trident. It has very low durability though, which is the problem. And that's it. That's kind of it. And actually, we do have something to show you. You can see the little bit of a purplish background in the back there. That is my new nether portal. I have never gone into the nether yet, in this world at least. So this is gonna be interesting. This is gonna be kind of interesting. I'm not gonna go in just about yet, because I'm trying to get some designs here. And that's about everything. Yes, actually. I got 4 diamonds from a mine, and it was scary. Yay. Okay, that's it. And I do have more iron. I'm trying to make an anvil, even though I have 16 blocks of iron. Those are all for hoppers, so I need some things for anvil. So I need to go get more, and this is it for now. This is just a little bit of an update. A very fast explanation later. Just wanted to tell you guys that I'm gonna make a super smelter off camera completely, because I don't want to do a time lapse about this. I will try to put the link in the description of the tutorial that I'm following, because I'm not good at the game, but still, I'll make it. Then I will see you again in a second. And actually, this is 16 blocks. I think I told you this last time as well. I'll have to make hoppers out of this. Should I do this on camera? I don't know if I should do this on camera. I need 24 hopper. Okay, time lapse.
Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Time lapse. Tiny time lapse. That's it. Tiny time lapse. Beautiful. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. This is gonna take a while. Tiny time lapse. So now I have to do the incredibly dull task of working out where the items are going to go, you know? So, you know what that means? It's a tiny time lapse. 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 Yes. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny really good. Tiny time lapse. Right. Tiny time lapse. Oh. Tiny time lapse. Wait, hang on, what? There's got to be a creative way in which we can work around this. It definitely isn't the fastest method in the world, but let's crack on with third person time lapse.
I'm always gonna use that.
Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse. Tiny time lapse.